My name is Fred Mitchell. I'm 59 years old, and I've been running a specialty steel fabrication business here in Spokane, Washington for over 30 years. When my son Jace gave me that ultimatum, either serve my wife like the rest of us do, or pack your bags and leave, I just smiled, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out. What he didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything for months, and his wife Ember wasn't the sweet girl he thought she was. She was running a sophisticated identity theft ring using our family, and when I discovered the truth, I realized my son had become her unknowing accomplice. If you're enjoying this story of family betrayal and justice, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Your support means everything. The morning started like any other Sunday in our quiet neighborhood. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, thinking about the precision cutting tools I'd be manufacturing for Boeing the following week. 31 years of building custom steel components had taught me to notice when something didn't fit right, when measurements were off, when someone was trying to pass inferior material as quality grade. Those same instincts had been nagging at me about my daughter-in-law for months. My house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch I'd owned outright for 15 years, had become a different place since Jace married Ember 2 years ago. What started as occasional family dinners had evolved into something that made my skin crawl. Ember had this way of asking for things that weren't really requests. "Fred, could you grab my purse from the car?" "Fred, I need you to drive me to the bank." "Fred, can you watch the kids while I handle some business?" Always delivered with that sweet smile that everyone else seemed to buy completely. But it was more than just the requests. I'd built my steel fabrication company from a garage workshop into a $1 million operation by paying attention to details, by noticing when patterns didn't add up, and the patterns around Ember definitely didn't add up. She always had cash, despite not having a job. She received packages at our house addressed to different names. She made phone calls in hushed tones, walking to another room whenever I entered. Most concerning of all, she'd started asking detailed questions about my business clients, my banking, and my personal information. The ultimatum came during what was supposed to be a pleasant family brunch. Ember had been unusually demanding that morning, asking me to cook breakfast for everyone, clean up afterward, and then drive her to 3 different locations around town. When I suggested she might want to contribute to the household work since she was living in my house rent-free, that's when Jace exploded. "Dad, you need to understand something," he said, his face red with anger I'd never seen before. "Ember is my wife now. She's the priority in this family. If you can't respect that and do what she needs, then maybe you don't belong here anymore." I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his mother died when he was 12, the young man I'd put through college with money from my steel business, the kid who used to help me in the shop every weekend, and I saw a stranger. Ember sat beside him with that satisfied smile, like she was watching a performance she'd choreographed perfectly. That's when Jace delivered the words that changed everything. "Either serve my wife like the rest of us do, or pack your bags and leave." The rest of us. That phrase hit me like a hammer to the chest. I realized then that this wasn't just about my house, my son, or even my family. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous than I'd understood. As I walked upstairs to pack my suitcase, my mind was already working through everything I'd observed, every strange conversation I'd overheard, every piece of mail that had arrived with unfamiliar names. I'd spent 3 decades building precision instruments, and now I was going to use that same methodical approach to discover exactly what Ember had been building in my house, and how my son had become part of it. Before Ember entered our lives, Jace and I had a solid relationship built on mutual respect and shared work ethic. After his mother, Sarah, passed away from cancer when he was just 12, it became just the 2 of us against the world. I taught him everything I knew about metalworking, precision engineering, and running a business with integrity. Weekend mornings, you'd find us in my shop behind the house, working on custom steel projects while classic rock played on the radio. Those were some of the best years of my life. My specialty steel fabrication company had grown from humble beginnings into a respected operation serving aerospace and manufacturing clients across the Pacific Northwest. Boeing, Lockheed, and several smaller precision manufacturers depended on the custom cutting tools and steel components I produced. The work required absolute accuracy. When you're making parts for aircraft, there's no margin for error. That attention to detail had served me well in business and in raising Jace as a single father. Our Sunday family dinners were a tradition that started when Jace was in high school and continued even after he moved into his own apartment in downtown Spokane. Every week he'd come over around noon, we'd cook together, watch football, and talk about everything from his job at the telecommunications company to his dating life. When he started bringing Ember around 18 months ago, I was genuinely happy for him. She seemed sweet, attentive, and most importantly, she made my son smile in a way I hadn't seen since his mother died. Ember fit into our routine seamlessly at first. She'd compliment my cooking, ask interested questions about the steel business, and even helped clean up after dinner without being asked. Jace was clearly head over heels in love, talking about marriage within the first few months of dating. As a father, you want to see your child happy, so when he asked for my blessing to propose, I gave it without hesitation. The wedding was a small affair at our local church with about 50 friends and family members. I paid for most of it, the venue, catering, flowers, and even Ember's dress, because I wanted my son to have a perfect day. Ember's family seemed nice enough, though I noticed they were vague about their backgrounds and didn't seem to have much money. Her parents claimed to be between jobs, and her two brothers were equally mysterious about their employment. But love makes you overlook red flags, and I figured every family had their struggles. After the wedding, the plan was for the newlyweds to save money by staying in my guest room for 6 months while they looked for their own place. 6 months turned into a year, then longer. Ember always had an excuse. They were waiting for a better apartment, saving for a down payment, or dealing with some temporary financial setback. Meanwhile, I was covering all the household expenses, groceries, utilities, even their cell phone bills. Jace's salary from the telecom company was decent, but somehow they never seemed to have any money left over at the end of the month. What I didn't realize was how gradually the dynamic in my house was changing. At first, Ember's requests were reasonable, asking me to pick up groceries on my way home from work, or wondering if I could drive her to appointments since Jace needed their car. But slowly, these requests became more frequent and more demanding. She'd leave lists of errands for me to run, expect me to prepare meals for guests she invited without asking, and generally treat me more like hired help than the homeowner. The most troubling change was in my son. Jace had always been independent and respectful, but living with Ember seemed to transform him into someone I barely recognized. He became defensive about everything she did, dismissive of my concerns, and increasingly demanding that I accommodate her wishes. If I suggested that maybe Ember could contribute more to the household, Jace would accuse me of being unwelcoming or old-fashioned. Looking back now, I can see how masterfully Ember orchestrated the entire situation. She isolated my son from his friends, convinced him that I was the problem in their marriage, and gradually turned my own house into her kingdom. The saddest part was watching Jace, this strong, intelligent young man I'd raised to think for himself, become completely dependent on her approval and validation. But even with all these red flags, I still believed we were just dealing with normal family adjustment issues. I told myself that marriages require compromise, that maybe I needed to be more flexible as Jace started his own family. I had no idea that Ember's true agenda was far more sinister than just freeloading or control. The woman I'd welcomed into my home as a daughter-in-law was systematically using my family, my business connections, and my good reputation to commit serious crimes. The first time I knew something was seriously wrong happened on a Tuesday evening in March, about 8 months after Ember moved into my house. I'd come home early from the shop because one of my Boeing contracts had been completed ahead of schedule, and I wanted to surprise Jace and Ember by cooking dinner for a change. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a black SUV with Oregon plates parked across the street, unusual for our quiet neighborhood where I knew every car and every neighbor. I walked through my front door and heard Ember's voice coming from the kitchen, but she was speaking in a tone I'd never heard before. Gone was the sweet, submissive voice she used around Jace and me. Instead, she was speaking with cold authority, like someone used to giving orders and having them followed without question. "The Mitchell account is perfect," she was saying. "He's got excellent credit, owns his business outright, and he trusts me completely. We can probably get at least $50,000 in credit lines before anyone notices." I froze in my own hallway, my keys still in my hand, trying to process what I was hearing. Ember continued talking to someone, apparently on a phone call since I didn't hear another voice in the kitchen. "Yes, I have access to all his business documents, bank statements, tax returns, client contracts, everything. The old man leaves his office unlocked, and Jace gives me information without even realizing it. This is going to be easier than the Johnson family in Portland. My blood ran cold. The Johnson family in Portland. I remembered Ember mentioning them once, supposedly old friends of her family who had helped her out financially when she was younger. But the way she was talking now made it clear that the Johnsons hadn't helped her. They had been her victims, just like I was apparently becoming. I stood there in my own hallway, afraid to move and make noise, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss destroying my financial life with the casual tone most people use to plan dinner. She mentioned my credit score, my business bank account numbers, and details about my client relationships that she should never have known. Most chilling of all, she talked about me like I was already finished, like my financial ruin was just a matter of paperwork and timing. Jace is completely under control, she continued. He'll believe whatever I tell him about his father. I've already started planting seeds about the old man being financially irresponsible and maybe developing dementia. When everything falls apart, Jace will think it's his father's own fault, and he'll support whatever story I need him to support. That's when I understood the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just identity theft or credit card fraud. This was a complete destruction of everything I'd built, orchestrated by someone who was using my own son as a weapon against me. Ember had been studying me for months, learning my habits, gaining access to my personal information, and positioning herself to destroy my business, my credit, and my reputation, while making my son believe it was all my own doing. I managed to back out of my house silently and sit in my truck for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd heard. When I finally went back inside, Ember was in the living room watching television, acting like the sweet, innocent young woman she pretended to be. She smiled at me warmly and asked about my day, showing not the slightest sign of the cold criminal I'd just overheard planning my destruction. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every request for information, every time Ember had been alone in my house with access to my office. I realized that what I'd interpreted as normal curiosity about my business had actually been systematic intelligence gathering. When she asked about my clients, she wasn't making conversation. She was identifying additional targets. When she offered to help organize my office, she wasn't being helpful. She was cataloging my financial documents. The most painful realization was understanding how completely Jace had been manipulated. My son genuinely believed he was protecting his wife from his unreasonable father, never suspecting that his wife was a professional criminal who had targeted our family specifically because of my successful business and excellent credit. She had studied us, chosen us, and was now systematically destroying us while using Jace's love as a shield. I knew I had to act, but I also knew I had to be smart about it. Ember was clearly experienced at this, and she had already started poisoning Jace against me. If I confronted them without evidence, she would just accelerate her timeline and disappear, leaving me to deal with whatever financial damage she'd already done. I needed to find out exactly what she had already put in motion, document everything, and figure out how to protect both my son and myself from whatever she had planned. That was the night I decided to become the hunter instead of the prey. The next morning, I started my investigation the same way I approached any complex steel fabrication project, with systematic planning and methodical execution. 31 years of running a precision manufacturing business had taught me that the key to solving problems was gathering accurate data, analyzing patterns, and then acting decisively based on the evidence. I treated Ember like a defective component that needed to be reverse-engineered to understand how it worked and why it was failing. My first step was securing my office and business documents. I installed a small security camera disguised as a smoke detector above my desk, positioned to capture anyone going through my files. I also moved all my most sensitive financial documents, tax returns, bank statements, client contracts, to a safety deposit box at my credit union downtown. What I left in my office were carefully prepared decoy documents with slightly altered account numbers and false information, designed to expose any unauthorized access. Within 3 days, my hidden camera captured Ember entering my office with a key she must have copied months earlier. I watched the footage of her systematically photographing my fake documents with her phone, paying particular attention to client information and financial details. She was thorough, professional, and completely comfortable operating in what she thought was a secure environment. This wasn't the work of an amateur. Ember moved through my office like someone with extensive experience in corporate espionage. Next, I used my business connections to investigate Ember's background more thoroughly. One advantage of running a specialty manufacturing company is that you build relationships with people in various industries, including some who work in law enforcement and private security. I reached out to Tom Bradley, a retired police detective who now ran background checks for local businesses, and asked him to look into Ember Morrison, the name she'd used when she married my son. Tom's findings were disturbing, but not surprising. There was no record of Ember Morrison existing before she appeared in Spokane 18 months ago. Her social security number belonged to a woman who had died in a car accident in Nevada 3 years earlier. The address she'd given Jace for her parents' house was actually a mail forwarding service in Boise, Idaho. Even her driver's license, which looked completely legitimate, had been issued using fraudulent documentation. But the most shocking discovery came when Tom ran her fingerprints through his law enforcement contacts. Ember Morrison was actually named Rebecca Chen, and she was wanted in connection with identity theft rings operating across Oregon, California, and Nevada. The FBI had been tracking her for 2 years as part of a larger investigation into organized financial fraud. The Johnson family in Portland she'd mentioned weren't just previous victims. They were part of a pattern of at least 7 families who had been systematically targeted, infiltrated, and financially destroyed. I spent the following week carefully monitoring my credit reports, bank accounts, and business finances. Sure enough, I discovered that 3 credit cards had been opened in my name over the past month, with a combined limit of $42,000. Someone had also submitted applications for a home equity loan and a business line of credit using my information. Most of these applications were still pending, but it was clear that Ember, or Rebecca, was in the final stages of executing whatever financial destruction she had planned. The most sophisticated part of her operation was how she was using legitimate businesses as fronts for her fraud. I discovered that she had established relationships with several local vendors who worked with my steel fabrication company, convincing them that she was my new business manager and could authorize purchases on my behalf. She'd already ordered over $15,000 in raw steel materials, computer equipment, and office supplies, all charged to accounts that would eventually trace back to me. During this investigation, I also started paying closer attention to my son's behavior and conversations. Jace had become increasingly critical of my business decisions, often mentioning concerns that Ember had raised about my financial management. He'd started questioning why I kept so much money in savings instead of investing it, why I didn't expand the business more aggressively, and whether I was really qualified to handle complex financial decisions at my age. These weren't thoughts that would naturally occur to my son. They were clearly ideas that Ember had planted to prepare him for my eventual financial collapse. Most heartbreaking was realizing that Ember had been systematically isolating Jace from his friends and extended family. She'd convinced him that his old friends were jealous of his happiness, that his cousins were trying to cause problems in his marriage, and that I was the biggest threat to their relationship. By the time I understood what was happening, my son had become completely dependent on Ember for social interaction, emotional support, and even basic decision-making. The final piece of the puzzle came when I followed Ember during one of her mysterious errands around town. She drove to a storage unit facility on the outskirts of Spokane, where she met with 2 men I recognized from surveillance photos Tom Bradley had shown me. Her brothers, who were also professional identity thieves wanted by federal authorities. Together, they loaded boxes of documents, electronics, and what appeared to be forged identification materials into her car. I realized then that my house hadn't just been infiltrated by a single criminal. It had become the headquarters for an entire family operation specializing in long-term financial fraud. They had chosen me specifically because my successful business, excellent credit, and trusting nature made me an ideal target for a months-long con that would yield hundreds of thousands of dollars before they disappeared to victimize their next family. The full scope of Ember's operation became clear when I made a discovery that nearly knocked me to my knees. While she was out running errands one Thursday afternoon, I used my copied key to search the guest room where she and Jace were staying. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under their bed, I found a metal lockbox containing documents that revealed the true extent of the nightmare I'd been living in. Inside that box were detailed profiles on over 20 families across 6 western states, each folder containing photographs, financial documents, family trees, and what could only be described as psychological profiles. The folder labeled Mitchell Family, Spokane, was thick with information going back 3 years, long before Ember had ever met my son. They had been studying me, researching my business, tracking my habits, and planning this operation since before Jace even knew Ember existed. The documents showed that they knew everything about me, my daily routines, my business clients, my banking patterns, even personal details like my late wife's maiden name and my mother's birthday. They had copies of my tax returns going back 5 years, photographs of my house and workshop, and detailed notes about my personality and psychological vulnerabilities. One page had a handwritten note that still makes my blood run cold. Target shows strong paternal instincts and guilt over wife's death. Son is the primary vulnerability point. Recommend romantic infiltration through son to establish trust and access. But the Mitchell folder wasn't even the most disturbing discovery. I found evidence that Ember's family had been running this same con for over a decade, targeting successful middle-aged men who had lost their wives and maintained close relationships with adult children. They had refined this operation into a science, with different family members playing specific roles in each con. Ember's specialty was seducing and marrying the target's adult son, while her brothers handled the technical aspects of identity theft and financial fraud. The documentation showed that their previous 7 victims had lost an average of $250,000 each before the family disappeared. Some had lost their homes, their businesses, and their relationships with their own children, who continued believing that their father's financial problems were self-inflicted long after the criminals had moved on to their next target. The Johnson family in Portland had lost everything: their house, their family restaurant, and their son's college fund. And the son still blamed his father for poor financial decisions rather than recognizing they'd been victims of professional criminals. Even more shocking was discovering how systematically they had been poisoning my relationship with Jace. The box contained printed copies of text messages between Ember and her brothers, discussing specific strategies for turning my son against me. They had researched common signs of dementia and financial incompetence, then coached Ember on how to plant suggestions in Jace's mind that I was exhibiting these symptoms. Every time she mentioned my forgetfulness or questioned my business decisions in front of Jace, it was part of a calculated campaign to make him believe I was mentally declining. I found receipts showing that they had already opened 17 different credit accounts in my name across 4 states, with a total available credit of over $300,000. They had used my information to establish business relationships with suppliers I'd never heard of, created fake contracts with non-existent clients, and even forged my signature on loan documents for equipment purchases that would never be delivered. The financial time bomb they'd constructed was far more sophisticated and devastating than I'd imagined. The most chilling discovery was a timeline showing they were planning to disappear within 2 weeks. Their exit strategy involved maxing out all the fraudulent credit accounts, liquidating whatever business assets they could access, and then vanishing before any of the financial institutions realized what had happened. By the time the dust settled, I would be facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt, potential criminal charges for the business fraud they'd committed in my name, and a son who believed his father had suffered a mental breakdown and destroyed their family through reckless financial decisions. But perhaps the most devastating document in that box was a psychological profile of Jace, written in clinical detail about his emotional vulnerabilities and how to exploit them. They knew about his mother's death, his abandonment issues, his need for approval, and his tendency to avoid confrontation. They had identified exactly which emotional buttons to push to make him defend Ember against anyone who threatened their operation, including his own father. The final page in my folder was labeled Contingency Plans, and outlined what they would do if I became suspicious or tried to interfere with their operation. The plan included having me committed for psychiatric evaluation, convincing Jace to seek guardianship over my finances due to my mental decline, and if necessary, filing false police reports claiming I had become violent or threatening toward Ember. They had prepared an entire arsenal of legal and psychological weapons to use against me if I tried to expose their crimes. As I sat in my guest room reading these documents, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a simple theft. I was facing a complete destruction of my life, my business, and my relationship with my son, orchestrated by professionals who had been planning this for years. They had anticipated every possible response I might have and prepared countermeasures designed to discredit me and isolate me from anyone who might believe my story. But they had made one critical mistake in their planning. They had assumed I would be a passive victim who would react emotionally rather than strategically. They had profiled me as a grieving widower and doting father, but they had underestimated the methodical problem-solving skills that had built my business and the protective instincts that had raised my son alone for over a decade. Now that I understood exactly what they were planning, I could prepare my own strategy to destroy their operation and save my son before they disappeared forever. The morning of the ultimatum, I had already spent 2 weeks gathering evidence and preparing my counterattack. I'd contacted FBI agent Patricia Coleman, who was leading the federal task force investigating Rebecca Chen and her family operation. I'd documented every fraudulent account, every forged document, and every conversation I'd secretly recorded using the listening devices I'd installed throughout my house. Most importantly, I'd prepared a complete dossier proving that my son was an unwitting victim rather than a willing accomplice. But I hadn't expected Ember to force a confrontation so quickly. Looking back, I realize she must have sensed that I was becoming suspicious, even though I'd been careful to maintain my normal routine. Professional criminals develop instincts about when their operations are in danger, and something about my behavior over the previous few days must have triggered her alarm bells. The family brunch that Sunday started normally enough. I made pancakes and bacon while Jace read the sports section, and Ember scrolled through her phone, probably coordinating with her brothers about their final preparations to disappear. The atmosphere felt tense, but I attributed it to my own anxiety about what I was planning to do. I had decided that today would be the day I confronted them with everything I'd discovered. But Ember struck first. She started making increasingly demanding requests, asking me to serve her breakfast in bed, clean up the kitchen while she relaxed, and then drive her to 3 different locations around Spokane for various errands that I now knew were probably final preparations for their exit strategy. When I finally suggested that maybe she could contribute more to the household work, that's when the mask came off completely. Jace's reaction was swift and violent in a way that shocked me. My son, who had always been respectful and reasonable, exploded with rage that seemed completely out of proportion to what I'd said. But now I understood that this wasn't really my son talking. This was months of psychological manipulation and emotional programming finally triggering exactly as Ember had planned. "Dad, you need to understand something," he said, his face red with an anger I'd never seen before. "Ember is my wife now. She's the priority in this family. If you can't respect that and do what she needs, then maybe you don't belong here anymore." As he spoke, I could see Ember watching him with satisfaction, like a puppet master enjoying a particularly successful performance. Every word coming out of my son's mouth sounded like something she had coached him to say. The phrases he was using, "respect that," "she's the priority," "you don't belong here," weren't natural expressions from the young man I'd raised. They were carefully planted scripts designed to isolate me and establish Ember's complete control over our family dynamic. That's when Jace delivered the words that changed everything. "Either serve my wife like the rest of us do, or pack your bags and leave." The phrase "the rest of us" hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about my house or my relationship with my son. Ember had successfully recruited other people, possibly including Jace's friends or co-workers, into her operation. The scope of manipulation was even broader than I'd realized, and the urgency of stopping her became crystal clear. But instead of arguing or trying to explain what I'd discovered, I made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I smiled calmly, stood up from the breakfast table and said, "You're absolutely right, Jace. I think it's time for me to go." The look of shock on Ember's face was priceless. She had expected me to fight, to argue, to create drama that would further turn Jace against me. My calm acceptance of the ultimatum clearly wasn't part of her script, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely uncertain about how to respond. "I'll just go pack a few things," I said, walking toward the stairs. "This is your house now." As I packed my suitcase, I could hear Ember and Jace talking in hushed, urgent tones downstairs. She was probably trying to figure out why her plan had worked so easily, while he was likely feeling guilty about how quickly his father had capitulated to his demands. But neither of them understood that I wasn't surrendering. I was executing the final phase of my own operation. In my bedroom, I placed calls to Agent Coleman, my attorney David Henderson, and my business insurance company. I activated the comprehensive security system I'd secretly installed throughout the house, which would now record everything Ember and her accomplices did in my absence. Most importantly, I triggered the legal documents that would protect my assets and ensure that when Ember's operation collapsed, my son would be clearly documented as a victim rather than a conspirator. When I walked downstairs with my suitcase, I looked at Jace one more time. My son, the boy I'd raised with love and dedication for over 20 years, was standing beside a woman who had systematically destroyed our family for money. But I knew that within 48 hours, he would understand exactly what had been done to both of us, and why his father had smiled when asked to leave his own house. I checked into a hotel downtown and waited exactly 24 hours before making the call that would destroy Ember's operation completely. During that time, my hidden cameras captured everything I needed to see. Within hours of my departure, Ember's two brothers arrived at my house with a moving truck, and together they began systematically looting anything of value they could find. They loaded my workshop tools, electronics, jewelry, and even my late wife's antique furniture, items that would be sold quickly before they disappeared forever. But more devastating than the theft was watching how Ember treated my son once she thought I was permanently out of the picture. The sweet, submissive wife act disappeared entirely, replaced by cold commands and obvious contempt. She ordered Jace around like a servant, criticized everything he did, and made it clear that he was now just another tool in her operation rather than a beloved husband. My son looked confused and hurt, clearly struggling to understand why his wife had suddenly become a stranger. The cameras also captured Ember on multiple phone calls, coordinating the final stages of their exit strategy. They planned to max out all the fraudulent credit accounts that week, liquidate whatever assets they could access, and then disappear before the weekend. Most chilling was hearing her discuss disposing of the loose end, meaning my son, who knew too much about their operation to be left behind, but was too much of a liability to take with them. Monday morning, I called Agent Coleman and told her it was time to spring the trap. Within 2 hours, FBI agents were positioned around my house and neighborhood, ready to arrest the entire Chen family operation when they attempted to leave with their stolen goods. I also called Jace and asked him to meet me at our usual breakfast spot downtown, claiming I wanted to apologize and discuss our relationship. My son looked terrible when he arrived at the diner. He was obviously exhausted, confused, and stressed in a way I'd never seen before. When I asked how things were going at home, he admitted that Ember had been acting strangely since I left, becoming demanding and hostile in ways that made him question whether he really knew his wife at all. "Dad, I think I made a mistake," he said quietly. "Something about how Ember reacted to you leaving doesn't feel right. It's like she's become a different person overnight." That's when I decided it was time to tell him everything. I pulled out copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. The fraudulent credit applications, the documentation of Ember's real identity, the FBI photos of her brothers, and most importantly, the detailed notes about how they had targeted our family specifically because of my business success and his emotional vulnerabilities following his mother's death. Watching my son's face as he processed the truth was heartbreaking. I could see the exact moment when everything clicked into place. When he realized that every conversation, every romantic gesture, every moment of intimacy with his wife had been part of an elaborate criminal conspiracy designed to destroy our family. The woman he had fallen in love with didn't exist, and the relationship he had cherished was nothing more than a professional performance. "She never loved me at all," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was just a way to get to you and the business." I explained how the Chen family had been running this exact same operation for over a decade, targeting families like ours with scientific precision. I showed him the profiles of their previous victims, including families where the son had continued believing their father was responsible for financial problems long after the criminals had disappeared. I helped him understand that he hadn't been weak or stupid. He had been systematically manipulated by professionals who knew exactly how to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities. The hardest part was showing him the documents that detailed how Ember had planned to abandon him once their operation was complete. She had never intended to disappear with him or include him in whatever new identity they assumed. To her, Jace had always been a disposable tool, useful for gaining access to me, but ultimately just another victim to be discarded when his usefulness ended. As we sat in that diner booth, I watched my son transform from a confused, manipulated victim back into the intelligent, strong young man I had raised. The fog of psychological manipulation was lifting, and he was beginning to see clearly for the first time in almost 2 years. When I told him that FBI agents were preparing to arrest Ember and her brothers at our house, he looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "What do you need me to do, Dad?" he asked. How do we make sure they pay for what they've done to our family? Jace and I returned to the house together just as the FBI was completing their arrests. The sight of Ember in handcuffs, screaming threats and obscenities while being loaded into a federal transport van was both satisfying and surreal. This was the same woman who had played the role of sweet, devoted wife so convincingly for almost 2 years. Her 2 brothers were also in custody, along with boxes of evidence that would connect them to fraud operations across multiple states. Agent Coleman briefed us on what they had found during the raid. In addition to the stolen items from my house, they discovered sophisticated identity theft equipment, forged documents for at least 30 different fake identities, and records showing the Chen family had stolen over $1.2 million from families across the western United States. The evidence I had gathered over the previous weeks was crucial in establishing the timeline and scope of their operation. But the most important moment came when Ember saw Jace and me standing together, clearly united against her. The mask of victimhood she had been wearing for the FBI agents disappeared completely, replaced by pure rage and malice. This was the real Rebecca Chen, not the sweet Ember Morrison who had charmed her way into our family, but a cold, calculating predator who viewed other people as nothing more than resources to be exploited. "You have no idea what you've done," she snarled at me through the window of the transport van. "Your precious son was supposed to believe you had dementia and lost all your money through poor decisions. He was supposed to blame you for everything and never suspect the truth. I could have made this clean and simple, but now you've ruined everything." Hearing her confirm the psychological manipulation plan in front of Jace was devastating, but also liberating. My son could see exactly how she had intended to destroy not just our family's finances, but our relationship itself. She had planned to turn him against me permanently, leaving me isolated and blamed for crimes she had committed while he spent years believing his father had suffered a mental breakdown. Jace was never going to come with us anyway, she continued, apparently deciding that if she was caught, she might as well inflict maximum psychological damage. "He was just a useful idiot who gave us access to your business and your trust. We were going to disappear and leave him here to deal with the financial wreckage. He would have spent the rest of his life paying for debts we created while thinking it was all your fault." The FBI agents tried to quiet her, but Ember wasn't finished destroying whatever illusions might have remained. She detailed how she had researched my late wife's death to understand my emotional vulnerabilities, how she had studied Jace's psychology to identify the most effective manipulation techniques, and how every moment of their relationship had been carefully calculated to achieve maximum access to our family's resources. The sex, the sweet conversations, the wedding vows, it was all just work, she said with a cruel smile. "I've done this exact same performance with 7 different families. Your son wasn't special. He was just another Mark who fell for the same techniques that worked on all the others." I watched my son process this final revelation about his marriage. The woman he had loved, planned a future with, and defended against his own father had never felt any genuine emotion for him at all. Every intimate moment, every shared dream, every expression of love had been a calculated performance designed to facilitate a crime. It was a level of betrayal that went beyond financial fraud into something much more personal and devastating. But instead of breaking down, Jace stood straighter and looked directly at Ember with a strength I was proud to see. "Thank you," he said calmly. "Thank you for finally showing me who you really are. And thank you for helping me understand how lucky I am to have a father who loved me enough to save me from this." That's when Ember's composure finally cracked completely. She began screaming profanities and making threats against both of us, revealing the violent, unstable personality that had been hidden beneath her carefully constructed facade. The FBI agents quickly closed the van doors and drove her away, ending the most toxic chapter of our family's history. As we stood in my driveway watching the federal vehicles disappear, Jace turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make up for the things I said to you, the way I chose her over family. You tried to protect me, and I turned against you." I put my arm around my son's shoulders and told him the truth, that he had been the victim of professional criminals who knew exactly how to exploit his love and trust. The important thing now was that our family had survived, and we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than manipulation. The legal aftermath of the Chen family's arrest moved quickly through the federal court system. Agent Coleman kept us informed as the case developed, and the scope of their criminal enterprise continued to expand. Rebecca Chen, her two brothers, and three additional accomplices were charged with conspiracy to commit identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering under federal organized crime statutes. The evidence I had helped gather was instrumental in building cases that would put them in federal prison for decades. More satisfying than the criminal charges were the civil consequences. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit worked with me to reverse every fraudulent transaction, close every fake account, and restore my credit rating to its previous excellent status. My business insurance covered the stolen equipment and tools, while the Federal Victim Restitution Program ensured I would be compensated for the financial damage they had attempted to cause. Within 6 months, it was as if the Chen family had never touched my financial life at all. But the most important healing happened between Jace and me. My son moved back into his old apartment downtown and threw himself into rebuilding his life with the same determination I had always admired in him. He attended therapy sessions to process the psychological manipulation he had endured and slowly began to trust his own judgment again. The strong, independent young man I had raised was emerging from the fog of manipulation that had controlled him for almost 2 years. Jace also took immediate steps to protect himself legally and financially. He filed for divorce from Rebecca Chen based on fraud and deception, a process that was expedited once her real identity and criminal background were established. He changed his name back to Mitchell, closed all joint accounts, and worked with attorneys to ensure that none of her crimes could be traced back to him. The legal system recognized him as a victim rather than an accomplice, which protected his career and future prospects. The impact on our community in Spokane was significant as well. Local law enforcement used our case to educate other families about romance scams and long-term fraud operations. My story became part of a federal awareness campaign warning business owners about the sophisticated techniques used by professional criminals to infiltrate families and steal identities. Several other local families came forward with suspicious situations that turned out to be early stages of similar operations. Most importantly, Jace and I rebuilt our relationship stronger than it had ever been before. The shared trauma of surviving a professional criminal operation created a bond between us that was deeper than our previous father-son relationship. We had protected each other when it mattered most, and that experience gave us both a new appreciation for family loyalty and trust. Our Sunday dinner tradition resumed, but now it included new elements. We talked openly about the manipulation techniques we had both experienced, helping each other recognize red flags that might indicate future deception. Jace became much more selective about the people he allowed into his personal life, while I developed better systems for protecting my business and personal information from potential infiltrators. The Chen family's attempts at revenge from prison were pathetic and ineffective. They tried to file lawsuits claiming I had entrapped them, made false accusations about my mental health, and even attempted to have other criminals harass me through phone calls and mail. But federal authorities treated these efforts as additional crimes, extending their sentences while providing me with enhanced victim protection services. The storage unit where I had observed their criminal operation yielded evidence that helped solve similar cases in Oregon, California, Nevada, and Idaho. Families who had been victimized years earlier finally got answers about what had happened to them, and in several cases, adult children were able to reconcile with fathers they had blamed for financial problems that were actually caused by the Chen family's crimes. Perhaps the most satisfying consequence was seeing Rebecca Chen's carefully constructed false identity completely destroyed. She had spent years building the persona of Ember Morrison, sweet, innocent, loving wife. And now she would spend decades in federal prison as Rebecca Chen, convicted felon and professional con artist. Every future background check, every parole hearing, every attempt to rebuild her life would be marked by her true criminal nature. My steel fabrication business not only survived the attempted destruction, but actually grew stronger. The publicity from the case brought me new clients who appreciated my methodical approach to problem solving and my refusal to be victimized by criminals. Boeing expanded their contract with my company, specifically citing my demonstrated reliability under pressure as a factor in their decision. The house felt different now, too. What had been a place of manipulation and hidden criminal activity became a genuine home again. I remodeled the guest room completely, removing every trace of the Chen family's presence and creating a space where legitimate visitors would always be welcome. Today, as I sit in my workshop behind the house here in Spokane, crafting precision steel components for another Boeing contract, I often think about that Sunday morning when my son delivered his ultimatum. Either serve my wife like the rest of us do, or pack your bags and leave. At the time, those words felt like a knife to my heart. Now I understand they were actually the key that unlocked the prison Rebecca Chen had built around our family. It's been 2 years since the arrests, and Jace has rebuilt his life completely. He met Sarah, a genuine woman who works as a pediatric nurse at Sacred Heart Medical Center, and they're planning a wedding next spring. This time, I've had the opportunity to get to know her gradually, to observe her interactions with both of us, and to see how she treats my son when she thinks no one is watching. The difference between real love and professional manipulation is crystal clear once you know what to look for. Our Sunday dinners have evolved into something richer than they ever were before. Sarah joins us regularly, and she brings a lightness to our family that had been missing for years. She asks genuine questions about my steel fabrication work because she's actually interested in learning, not because she's cataloging information for criminal purposes. When she helps clean up after dinner, it's because she wants to contribute, not because she's maintaining a false persona designed to gain access to my financial documents. The federal prison system has been very good about keeping me informed of Rebecca Chen's status. She's currently serving a 23-year sentence at a federal facility in Arizona, with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. Her brothers received similar sentences, and the entire criminal network they had built over the past decade has been permanently dismantled. Agent Coleman tells me that our case became a model for how families can fight back against long-term fraud operations when they're willing to be methodical and patient. My business has grown beyond anything I had imagined possible before this ordeal. The precision and attention to detail that helped me uncover Rebecca's operation has also made me a sought-after contractor for increasingly complex aerospace projects. Last month, I hired 2 additional employees and expanded my workshop to handle the increased demand. The irony isn't lost on me that Rebecca's attempt to destroy my financial life actually led to the most successful period in my company's history. But the most important change has been in how Jace and I communicate with each other. We've learned to discuss concerns directly rather than letting them fester, to ask questions when something doesn't feel right, and to trust our instincts about people who enter our lives. The manipulation techniques that Rebecca used on both of us are now things we can identify and protect against, making us stronger individually and as a family. I've also become something of an expert on romance scams and family fraud, speaking at community events and business associations about how to protect yourself from professional criminals. The story of how I smiled, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out of my own house has become a cautionary tale that's helped other families recognize when they're being manipulated. Several business owners have contacted me after my presentations, reporting that they had identified and stopped similar operations targeting their own families. The phrase that once represented the lowest point in my relationship with my son, either serve my wife like the rest of us do, or pack your bags and leave, has become a reminder of how powerful love can be when it's combined with strategic thinking. I served my family by refusing to serve a criminal, and I saved my son by being willing to temporarily lose him. Looking back, I realized that Rebecca Chen made a fundamental mistake in her psychological profile of me. She saw a grieving widower who would be emotionally manipulated through his love for his son, but she missed the methodical problem solver who had built a successful business through 30 years of careful planning and precise execution. She thought she was targeting a sentimental old man, but she had actually chosen to victimize someone with the exact skills needed to destroy her operation. If you're watching this video because you recognize elements of manipulation in your own family relationships, trust your instincts. Document everything, seek professional help from law enforcement or private investigators, and remember that real love never requires you to serve someone who's destroying your family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is grab your suitcase and walk away, knowing that truth and justice will eventually bring your real family back together. The ultimatum that almost destroyed us ultimately saved us, and today, both my son and I are stronger, wiser, and more grateful for the genuine relationships in our lives than we ever were before Rebecca Chen taught us the difference between love and manipulation. If you enjoyed this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed too good to be true? Your engagement helps us bring you more compelling stories of ordinary people who refuse to be victims.